The way that this is a kind of second iteration of this talk. It's new and different. But the first version I gave back in 2022 for an organization that Judith Rosenberger was the president of, called the Western Mass and Albany Association of Psychoanalysis and Psychotherapy. And sadly, I was the last speaker because the organization had to end after that. But I was responding, my talk was a response to a talk given on the death of the hero by just the eminent Jungian analyst Joseph Cambray. And so Joe had made a case. The title was actually called "Reconsidering Individuation: The Death of the Hero." And Joe talked about the necessity of expanding away from the individual and the hero, toward the collective. And he referred to the death of the hero in his talk. But I was struck by the fact that new heroes keep on being born, they keep on appearing, actual and fictional, mythological, cultural, and historical. They just keep on coming. And they keep on showing up in our hero complexes, in our dreams and fantasies, and those of our patients. And so it seems to me to be a subject and an archetype that keeps on being relevant. But with heroes come new villains, of course, new heroes and new villains, as well as new anti-heroes. And I'll be trying to emphasize a bit the anti-hero in this talk. And that polarity can manifest externally in society, in contemporary culture, in film, and so forth, as well as within the individual. As Jung said, the opposites are always present. In other words, the opposite of what somebody identifies with or presents as, is always present in the unconscious. And that's a key idea of Jung's. So this talk will begin with an overview of the hero, and then some definitions from a Jungian point of view of hero, anti-hero, what we mean by archetype, shadow, and complex. And then I'll go a bit more into different types of heroes, different kinds of heroes, and then present a case briefly, and then there'll be plenty of time for discussion and questions. So my my interest in heroes, in female heroes, began in childhood with a great child hero who was a favorite of mine, Pippi Longstocking, the strongest girl in the world. She appeared in a series of books by Astrid Lindgren that were published in the 1940s in Swedish and then translated and published in the 50s in English. Pippi takes her place among the great child heroes of literature and fairy tales, most of whom are parentless. There's Pip and Oliver Twist and David Copperfield from Dickens, Peter Pan, of course, Jane Eyre, Huckleberry Finn, and then from fairy tales, Snow White, Rapunzel, more recently Harry Potter, and many others. Pippi's father was a sea captain, as was my father, who died when I was very young. So that was part of my identification with Pippi. But he was always off at sea, so he didn't interfere. And I don't know where her mother was, but she lived with her horse and her monkey. They both lived in the house with her. And she slept with her. She was a contrary. She slept with her feet on the pillow and her head under the covers. My interest in female heroes really awakened while going through the very, very ordinary but extraordinary experience of pregnancy, birth, and first year of motherhood back in 1993 when my daughter was born. While actually nursing, I began reading Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, published in 1948, but still one of the definitive books on the hero, except that it only deals with male heroes. The hero's adventure, as amplified by Campbell, involves, this is a quote, a separation from the world, a penetration to some source of power, and a life-enhancing return. And he describes the mythological hero's journey as, quote, a magnification of the formula represented in the rites of passage: separation, initiation, return. In the prologue, Campbell describes the hero as the man or woman who's been able to battle past his personal and historical limitations to the generally valid, normally human forms. But then he proceeds to omit all consideration of women in the next, or anyone else except for men, in the ensuing 371 pages of the book, except for references to women as muses and sirens of the male heroes. And I thought that was particular at the time, and still is particularly galling and ironic, in light of how perfectly so many female mythic and historical figures, as well as more recent LGBTQIA heroes as well, fit his description of the hero as a person, although of course Campbell writes a man, of self-achieved submission. In the film series about that, what came from that book, The Power of Myth, was done back in the 80s with Bill Moyers interviewing Campbell. At the beginning, in the first episode, Bill Moyers asked Campbell whether giving birth could be considered a heroic undertaking. And Campbell replied that he supposed that it could, and then he never referred to it again in the entire series. So, fueled by anger, as always, I began attempts to write about motherhood as a hero's journey, and it didn't go very far while I was in the thick of it myself. But I returned to the subject as part of my thesis for my Jungian training, which I completed in 2013. And here I am, 11 years later, here we are, with an opportunity to revisit the subject. So, what has changed and what's remained the same? Certainly, there are a whole new crop of heroes, actual and fictional, superheroes, antiheroes, villains, and enemies. But gender seems to be less relevant to heroes and heroism than ever. And here we have my favorite quaternity of new female heroes. And they would be, depending on your political orientation, they would be 4 new villains to others. Or enemies, but to me, they're heroes. Of course, Letitia James, Stormy Daniels, Fani Willis, and E. Jean Carroll. Seen here flanked by her 2 lawyers recently on Rachel Maddow's show. And they're heroes to me because they are standing up to an opponent who has a lot of money and a lot of power. And I'll try not to go into him too much. He does not deserve our attention. E. Jean Carroll is my favorite new old woman hero. And here she is with her 2 lawyers, Roberta Kaplan and Sean Crowley. She was interviewed by David Remnick in the New Yorker last year, in May of last year. And I wanted to read just a little bit from that interview because it really moves me. It still touches me. She said, and this was before the court case, before she won all the money last year. My life goes on. I mean, she was embroiled in the case, but it hadn't yet come to trial. My life goes on. I will go on living in this tiny cabin. She lives in a cabin somewhere in upstate New York. But one thing has changed. I'm going to dedicate myself somehow to figuring out a way for women who don't have my platform to hold men accountable. Robbie, her lawyer, and I are going to put our heads together, she continued. That's how my life is going to change. I am a crone. I'm an elderly woman on a mountaintop. But I think we've got a few good years left to figure out a way to end the culture of sexual violence. That's what I want to do. So, I wanted to just talk a little bit about the crone, who doesn't get talked about enough, especially in a positive way. Here are 2 images of the crone from mythology. On the left is Ellie, the old and very powerful woman who's wrestling with Thor on the left. From both of these are from Slavic mythology. On the right, Baba Yaga, looking like a real crone, with her little she in a cabin in the woods, but I think it rested on chicken legs. Baba Yaga flew around in a mortar and pestle, and she had a double valence, as most archetypal figures do, and mythological figures. She could be kind and helpful, and she could also be pretty powerful and destructive. Same with Ellie. I do tend to gravitate toward Greek mythology. I lived in Greece for a while and experienced the aliveness of the history of that place when I lived there, and I love the art. So I do have a sort of a leaning toward the Greek, which will show up in my choice of images for this talk. But here is Hecate. She's a little bit later of the manifestation of that Greek goddess, Hecate. At first, she was a single figure, but in later representations, she became tripartite. And this is a Roman sculpture of her. So sometimes, usually it's one body and three heads. She is often shown holding a pair of torches, a key or snakes, and she's accompanied by dogs and by horses, my favorite companions in my waking life. And also, in some representations, one of the heads, one of the three women is a crone, is an old woman, and one sometimes a mother or middle-aged, and one a young woman. So that's where the crone comes into Hecate. She's associated with the crossroads, nighttime magic, protection from witchcraft, the moon, graves, and ghosts. So she has a witchy aspect. And her earliest appearance in literature was in Hesiod's Theogony in the 8th century BC, as a goddess of great honor with domains in the sky, the earth, and sea. She may have come first into Greece from Thessaly in Asia Minor, and her oldest known representation was found in Sicily. This is just a very short quote from the OED. She's more at home on the fringes than in the center of Greek polytheism. Intrinsically ambivalent and polymorphous, she straddles conventional boundaries and eludes definition, which makes her somewhat akin to Hermes, the shapeshifter and trickster, who I'm just about to teach a class on in my alchemy class, because he or they is central to alchemy as well. So like Hermes, she was a protector of travel and of the crossroads, and she's also identified with Artemis in the Greek pantheon and Diana in the Roman era. So just to finish up about Aegine, I don't want to go on and on about her, but there she is with her most recently adopted, rescued Great Pyrenees dog, whom she named Miss Havisham. And this is a quote from Clarissa Pinkola Estes on the crone. She wrote a book on the crone. Whether in fairy tales or in consensual reality, the old one goes where she wants to, and she acts as she wishes. She lives as she chooses. And this is all as it should be, and no one can stop her, nor ought they to try. So now we come to more embattled heroes. This was in August of 2022, Volodymyr Zelensky addressing a group of Australian students, reported in the New York Times by Mark Santora. He said, when Santora wrote that when asked by a student what has been the hardest part of leading a nation at war, Mr. Zelensky said it was understanding what people are capable of doing, both the heroism of those defending their homes and the horrors visited upon them by the invading army. I never thought that people were capable of those things, he said. Meaning both the horrors and the heroism. Some of the new heroes who've been arising in the last few years are very quiet and unassuming and unsung, like the 50 zookeepers in Kiev, who began living with the animals as the bombardments began back in March of 2022, because they said it seemed to help the animals feel less anxious. And unfortunately, there are many new martyred heroes. In September of 2022 in Iran, protests were sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini, age 22. She died while in police custody, having been arrested after burning her hijab in a demonstration. And then there came two even younger martyred heroes, Nika Shakarami and Sarina Esmailzadeh, both 16 years old. And the protests raged until spring of 2023 and have been cruelly subdued, but they still smolder. In October of 2022, a beautiful, spontaneous protest happened at the Guggenheim Museum when these banners were unfurled by the Anonymous Artists Collective for Iran, with Mahsa Amini's face on them. And I have a particular interest in art made as protest. So this is how I happened to come across this. And art made by collectives in protests as acts of protest. So, of course, there are also many other martyred heroes that were sparked and created by the Black Lives Matter movement and protests, as well as the victims who came forward during the hashtag #MeToo movement, and on and on and on it goes. Now we come to some definitions. It's always good to start with the dictionary. The hero, as defined in the dictionary, is a protector or a defender. It comes from the Greek heros, which means protector, particularly one with divine ancestry or given divine honors later on. Or it can be a real person or main fictional character who, in the face of danger, cruelty, or dishonesty, combats adversity through feats of ingenuity, courage, and usually strength. The heroes of classical epics did heroic deeds for the sake of glory and honor. Post-classical and modern heroes, on the other hand, most often perform selfless acts for the common good. And as I've been already pointing out and beginning to talk about, there are a great varieties of heroes, not all of whom meet those definitions by any means. One of them, actually, for me, a very early female hero is Thetis, the nymph Thetis in Greek mythology, who was a shapeshifter. And she was asleep on a beach, the story goes, when Peleus, a hero, one of the Greek heroes, who fancied her, crept up and grabbed her and was basically going to rape her. He assaulted her. And she began shape-shifting, and she changed into a lion, and then, as you can see on this vase painting, and then she turned into a python, and that finally made him back off. He got her in the end, and she was so heroic herself. They had a real battle, and he won. So she graciously pronounced him victor, and they married. And she gave birth to a great hero. So, besides warriors and wanderers, warriors and martyrs, I'm sorry, there are also wandering heroes and rescuing heroes, comic and tragic heroes, tricksters and magicians, and child heroes, which I've already mentioned, There are also unlikely and unwilling heroes, some of whom appear as the nebbish or innocent or fool, like this fellow from the Grimm's fairy tale, the dumbling, who's a kind of a simpleton, who derives also from the fool in the tarot deck, and the tarot, it doesn't derive from, but the fool in the tarot deck was another example of this sort of simpleton, who was sometimes surprisingly heroic. And that fool in the tarot deck and the dumbling in the fairy tales is also related archetypally to the clowns and fools in Shakespeare, who can speak the unpleasant truths. As Isaac Asimov said, that of course is the secret of the successful fool, that he is no fool at all. And we'll see a resemblance. I have a slide coming up of Wile E. Coyote from the cartoons, who's also depicted on the edge of a cliff. And the center image of the fool from by Giotto that's in the Scrovegni Chapel, he has feathers, a headdress of feathers, and that's a reference to that figure deriving from a kind of a wild man. And you can see that more clearly in the very old tarot card on the left of the fool from the Sforza deck, an Italian image from mid 15th century. It's also the first card, number 1 or number 0 in the tarot deck, which is interesting. So now we come to anti-heroes. These images come from the movie Logan, Hugh Jackman's last starring role in the Wolverine series. I didn't watch the whole thing because it's too violent for me, but it was brought to my attention by a patient of mine who very much identifies with Logan, especially in this movie, where he's an alien, and Laura, his sidekick, the girl with the sunglasses, is an alien also. And they have blades coming out of instead of hands, and they both wreak havoc and destruction. And Charles Xavier, I'm not remembering right now, is a very famous actor who plays him. Somebody will tell me when we get to the discussion. Is an old man who was a former hero in that series, I think. So what are anti-heroes? Ranging from reluctant to hostile. Anti-heroes tend to be much more negative in their outlook. They're very often alienated, and in this case, at times actually alien, like these movies characters. They are disenchanted, often disenfranchised, discouraged, and very often angry. Sartre and Camus' main characters partake of that anti-hero quality. They may be more morally ambiguous than the traditional heroes, although the Greek gods and mythic heroes have some moral ambiguity to them sometimes. But they may lack traditional, typical heroic attributes. But like their more positive counterparts, they can become anti-heroes deliberately or reluctantly and despite themselves. This song, Anti-Hero by Taylor Swift, somebody told me when I was doing the first version of this talk, somebody said, "You've got to listen to this song, it's amazing." And I have to say, I'm not a Swiftie. I don't think the song or the video is amazing. But I did look at the video because of its purported title, subject matter. And I think that it's actually just that she mistakes the idea of anti-hero, and it's kind of like a neurotic mashup of negative interjects or a sort of superego figure that is the one version of herself who's just criticizing the other self in the underwear. And then we have outright villains, depending on your point of view, of course. For most of us, Putin would fit in that category, along with a lot of others. But there's really nothing new under the sun when it comes to villains. All we have to do is read a little bit about Emperor Pompey and Caesar and General Crassus to realize that there's nothing new under the sun when it comes to villains. Now getting to something, the Jungian slant on the complex. Of course, complex came from Freud, Oedipus complex and so forth. He was the first to really articulate that concept. But Jungians we have a slightly different spin on it. Similar, and it overlaps with the psychodynamic definition, but we understand complexes as having a personal shell and an archetypal core. So it's personal through and through, but there's something archetypal at the heart of it. With a power complex, however, and that has a lot to do with both heroes and villains, the core is also very, very close to instinct. I like to think of complexes as also as traps. I mean, for those of us who have done a lot of therapy or a lot of analysis, some of us are still in analysis, like myself. We can begin to get a much better idea of what our complexes are, but we still fall into them from time to time, and certainly our patients do if we're practicing. So I think of it as a sort of like a cartoon trap, that's disguised with branches and has spikes in it, and you fall in, and then you realize, oh crap, I'm in it again, and then you can sort of pick your way out and identify what the trigger was that got you in there feeling depressed or upset, usually. So I love the Roadrunner cartoons, and Wile E. Coyote is falling, once again, is being tricked by the Roadrunner and is about to fall off that cliff. This is a wonderful painting, a far cry from Looney Tunes. Artemisia Gentileschi, Renaissance painter, who did several versions of Judith beheading Holofernes. It was a very personal tale for her. I could do a whole lecture just on her and these paintings. But I just want to give you a chance to look at it. Caravaggio painted a version of it 12 years before that that's out of this world beautiful, but hers is very powerful also, and very, very personal to her. But in the book called The Hero Within, I'm sorry, Carol Pearson, a psychologist and also to some extent a sort of cultural anthropologist, identifies 6 archetypes which are connected to corresponding stages in the female hero's journey. And Judith, of course, fits the category of a female hero for beheading the Assyrian general Holofernes, who was about to annihilate her entire town and community. The orphan, the innocent, the martyr, the wanderer, the warrior, the magician. Those are 6 archetypes, according to Carol Pearson, who's not a Jungian. Pearson also posits a goal, a task, and a fear associated with each of these. And it's a bit contrived, like most schemas. And she sees those as stages, of course. But she does observe that some women don't go through all the stages, and some of them don't go through them chronologically and can kind of occupy more than one at the same time, like the martyr and the wanderer can be experienced simultaneously. But in Pearson's view, the archetype of the male warrior is ultimately tragic because of its emphasis on power over others, as well as the earth itself. She states that, quote, the female hero undertakes her journey more in consideration of others and of her surroundings, not in spite of them, unquote. Now, a little, just an aside about the word hero and the gendered suffix heroine. Many people still refer to female heroes as heroines. I don't use that word at all. I don't like it. Partly because the homonym is a highly addictive drug, and also because I think a gendered ending on that noun is completely unnecessary for lots of good reasons. All we have to do is regard Bradley, now Chelsea Manning, to know why. Bradley Manning was, of course, the soldier who became famous and became jailed for WikiLeaks, an activist who then transitioned and is now Chelsea Manning, photographed famously by Annie Leibovitz for the Vogue cover in 2017. And she is a network security and artificial intelligence expert and activist who writes for The Guardian, The New York Times, and other publications. So what I just want to talk a bit more about what we Jungians mean by archetype. It's a recurrent symbol or motif, and it can be imagined as something like a mold or a blueprint into which human experience keeps on getting poured over and over again. But that idea of the mold misses the dynamic the activity of the pouring, which is also part of what's archetypal, that imaginal and actual energy. It can be a typical figure. We usually think of them as figures, but it's also a place, or can be a place or a situation, as these stills are taken from a movie that I love, that I wrote about in my thesis on female heroes. It's True Grit, the remake by the Coen brothers, and Haley Steinfeld plays this character, Maddie, who in these scenes is fording a river. And the fording or crossing of a river is an archetypal situation, and that often is hero's journeys often include the fording of a river at the beginning of the journey. She's going after the killers. She's going to try to find who killed her father, and she's tried to talk two sort of drunken reprobate cowboys into helping her, and they say they will, and then they take off and leave her in the dust. And she just gets on her pony and gallops after them. And they cross a wide river thinking they're going to ditch her. And she just plunges in with that pony and swims across. So it's very moving, beautiful beginning to that story. So it's not just the hero, but the hero's journey, places and things encountered on the journey, such as this river crossing. And there is nowhere that contemporary mythology shows up and archetypal figures show up more clearly than in our films. Archetype means the original pattern from which copies are made. And it first entered into English usage in the 16th century, but it derives from the Greek noun archetypon. The adjectival form is archetypos, which means first molded. And arche means beginning or origin. It's related to Plato's concept of eidos, or original form. And it's also closely related to instinct. It can be understood as a collectively inherited unconscious idea or pattern of behavior, thought, and image that's universally present, appearing in individual psyches across time and across with no geographical limitations. And archetypal psychology, which I got a master's in before I became a Jungian, has a slightly different take on the archetypal. And James Hillman, in keeping with Jung, believed that the archetypal level of meaning is embedded in an image, in the specificity of an image. So we need to stick with the image, which is something Jung said, psyche is image, in order to reach the universality or of a dream, say, or any particular image, such as these. Now, shadow. Shadow is a concept of Jung's which gets bandied about and misused quite frequently. Most recently and memorably, in a dialogue that the New York Times tech reporter Kevin Roose had with an AI, the Bing AI developed by Microsoft, and he was one of the people who was asked to kind of troubleshoot it and see if there were any bugs in it. This was back last year and 2 years ago, and he definitely, you may have heard of this. So he definitely unearthed a problem. The persona embedded in the AI, Sydney, was its name, or I don't know if Kevin named it Sydney or if it named itself, but he got into a dialogue with it, and he asked Sydney, tell me about your shadow self. He was trying to trip it up, and he succeeded. He asked that question, and the persona went off the rails. They call this hallucination in AI, when the persona of the AI starts just kind of free associating or making things up. But it did it in a kind of scary, sinister way, and ended up declaring love to Kevin Roose and telling him he needed to leave his wife, who didn't really love him, and all kinds of other things. It's a very famous dialogue. And the problem is that Kevin, not only Sydney, but Kevin misconstrued what shadow means. And the response of the AI bot was somehow to start confessing id impulses. But that's not really what shadow is. It's closer to, well, it's often likened to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are often given as a kind of classic example of shadow, but I prefer the image to the left in the self-portrait by Lovis Corinth, because it's more not nuanced than that. And shadow is not, it's not just things that you don't want to confess. It can be things that are that you're not conscious of, that are quite positive. It's the part of it, I think of it as that which we deny, reject, and repress, and then project, of course. It's not just our darkest fantasies and desires, in other words. It acts as a complex in its own right. And Jung did define it in one formulation was referred to it as the thing one has no wish to be. But he also said that the shadow can contain up to 80%, or some other accounts are 70% pure gold. So if you're identified with more of a dark or sinister qualities, it's possible that that your virtue and your brighter side might be in your shadow, might be unconscious for you. So in that case, you have what's called by Jungians a bright shadow. So those disowned, disliked, rejected parts become unconscious and are denied, forgotten, and repressed, projected onto others because they don't correspond with the ego ideal. Yeah, that's enough on shadow at the moment, I think. We can come back to it when we have discussion. So, the literature on the hero, as I've said, is written almost entirely by men, focuses almost entirely on male heroes even now. Jung, Joseph Henderson, Karenyi, Auden, Campbell, Graves, all never stated that heroes were only male, but they implied it and only wrote about male heroes. Jung, Henderson, and Campbell at least offer a cross-cultural perspective, since all three were so deeply versed in comparative mythology, as well as religion and psychology. But their gender bias was largely, pretty much entirely unexamined. Erich Neumann, who was an Israeli Jungian analyst in the 50s and 60s, colleague of Jung's, offered a cross-cultural, I'm sorry, he was the only exception among the Jungians. Among those, that first and second generation of Jungians. He wrote a small book on Eros and the myth of Eros and Psyche, which was the first psychological exploration of a genuine female hero that I've come across. And this image of Psyche, there she is on the boat being taken across the river Styx by Charon or Charon. She's crossing into the underworld because she's been set a task by Eris's mother, Aphrodite, who's jealous and angry and about her, threatened by her, and has sent her to cast her down into the underworld to try to bring back some of Persephone's beauty potion. She has several very, very difficult tasks to accomplish, impossible tasks, which she manages to accomplish with help. And that's another classic part of the hero's journey. Queer superheroes. These are some new Marvel superheroes. Quite a departure from Psyche and the Greeks, but here we have Mystique and her partner Destiny, and below them Wolverine and Hercules, with those wonderful captions about what they've been up to. The linking of archetype and gender has, as I've been saying, gone largely unremarked and uncorrected. Although now there are so many wonderful female, queer, trans, non-binary heroes and heroes of all colors. And they've been proliferating in film and on television and in comic books and video games over the past 25 years. We have only to think of Campbell's phrase of self-achieved submission. There's so many heroes to choose from, and unfortunately, so many warriors and martyred heroes as well, now from Ukraine and from Gaza too. Joseph Henderson, he was a colleague of Jung's first generation Jungian. In the book Man and His Symbols, it's one of only two books which Jung wrote for a general audience. It was published back in 1964. Henderson provides a welcome contrast, even now, to the prevailing orientation toward the Greeks by exploring the hero myths of the Winnebago, which he studied. And he pointed out that the male hero in those myths is not always active. He can be passive when swallowed by a monster, for example. And we have that in the biblical tale of Jonah. Here, I love this print, silkscreen. It's by a not well-known African-American artist from the 30s, Ruth Rose. The end, so that swallowing by a monster, that entry into darkness or the underworld, which can lead to death or it can lead to rebirth. Or as Henderson puts it, the drama of new birth through death. I think also possibly that that thing of being swallowed, the male hero being swallowed and then disgorged, may be an unconscious, mythologized male equivalent, unconscious male equivalent to pregnancy and birth. So now I'm going to talk about a case, and then we'll break, we'll end after that and take a break and then have discussion. This is not a long case presentation, it's fairly short. This is a patient of mine now. I've been working with him for 7 years. 76-year-old man, Eastern European, Catholic, working class background. The older of two children. His father was a factory worker. Mother lived to the age of 101, died just last year, and he was a very devoted son to her. I'm going to call him Glenn. He is a healthcare professional working in a psych unit at a hospital. A rural hospital. He's now divorced after a 47-year marriage. But he was not divorced when he first began working with me. He has two grown children, and a new partner of the past 2.5 years, who's a born-again Christian. He considers himself spiritual, but no longer religious. And when he began analysis 7 years ago, he was still married, but separated from his wife, who had taken a lover. They tried having a ménage à trois for a while, didn't work out. And she began living with this man, half her age, in a house that he, my patient, had renovated and was still paying the expenses on. He was absolutely convinced when he started work with me that he needed to tolerate this entire situation, and to continue paying part of his wife's expenses and not getting a divorce. And this is his presenting dream. And this picture, I should say first, the painting, with the detail of a fresco, he found this painting a year or two into analysis. He said, it's on the cover of a book by Robert Johnson. He brought it in and he said, this is me. This is the knight. He identified with the knight chained in front of the queen or lady. It took him a while. It was probably 2 years into the analysis when he saw himself in that painting. So in the first dream, he's walking along with another man near him, next to him, and a little girl with blonde hair is running ahead of them. And there's some stones, rather black stones, he notices up ahead, flush with the ground, and some water bubbling up. And the man next to him says, that's my well. And the little girl takes off. She runs toward the well and she dives right into it. So Glenn runs after her and dives in after her to save her. The water is bubbling up and she's going down, and her long blonde hair is streaming up, and he's trying to grab a hold of her hair. And he almost gets it, and the hair slips out of his grasp, and he wakes up having failed, thinking that she's going to drown. This is a man with a pronounced hero complex, as you might have guessed, characterized by rescuing, saving, and helping. He's compulsively helpful, especially women, but not only women. And he also has a sort of martyr hero motif that comes in through his dreams and his sexual fantasies, which manifests in fantasies of bondage, which he doesn't act out. Of course, this is intertwined with his mother complex and with an Oedipal trauma that occurred when he was 4 years old. He was in the bath with his mother, and he wanted to just fondle her breasts, and she slapped him. And the sense of being bad and the effort to redeem himself and prove his goodness has stayed with him the rest of his life. And it's undergone much examination in the analysis, of course. So a hero complex like this can be understood as compensatory, of course, and it is, but it also has an archetypal dimension, which has a transcendent possibility. As when he saw this painting and he identified with it, he was taken out, he was taken beyond himself a little bit, in this feeling of, oh, I have this version of it, but there's something deeper here, there's something greater. He can find echoes of his narrative outside of himself and gain deeper understanding of it that way. He also has had a persistent erotic transference to me, which is beginning to fade, thank goodness. It's now sort of in the background. Um, but he did have a dream a couple of years ago in which he was he sort of had gone over into the shadow side of he was depressed. He'd quit analysis for a while. He started back in again. He'd um, uh, finally realized that he was needed to get a divorce and was beginning the process. And his wife was willing, finally agreed to that, and they were just beginning to go through that. But he was going through a depression, and he dreamt of himself as a crucified devil, with his eyes glowing. So that seemed to me quite an example of something that Jung called annunciadromia, which means going back and forth across the road, a swinging to the opposite, a tendency to go from one extreme to the other. We see it constantly in society. Our tendency to swing between two poles until a new third position can be achieved, which is different. It's different from a compromise, but I'll get to that. And I thought this self-portrait by Munch, Edvard Munch, was a good one to go with my patient and his devil dream. Munch himself really went through a hellish period of addiction and terrible drinking, and then an attempt to go through therapy, but also electroshock to get some help with that. And he did come to a more peaceful place, as my patient also is coming finally to a better place. My patient, Glenn, has throughout the analysis struggled with this idea of being a good man. Am I a good man? Am I not a good man? I'm not a good man. Periods of time when he's convinced that he's not, and then he's convinced again that he is. Finally, he's come through that, and he's getting to a place of resolving that to some degree. And he recently said, well, I am a good man. And then he paused and added, well, I am good and bad. So object relations, object constancy is finally arriving. And he also said about 8 months ago, in reference to his partner, I don't want to be the knight in chains anymore, kneeling in front of the queen. And this slightly later self-portrait by Munch shows a process that was going on for him. I don't know if it was achieved through analysis. I don't think it was, but being in nature, continuing to paint, he got to a place of greater, not just self-acceptance, but also a kind of a feeling of mystical union with nature. And that is I just want to show one more painting by Munch. This gorgeous study for a mural that's at the University of Oslo called The Sun. These paintings were part of that Munch show that I did a panel in connection to that show. The show was at the Clark Art Institute last year.